This has been an amazing afternoon, and I'm honored to introduce our final speaker, David Biale, who's Emanuel Ringelblum Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Jewish History at UC Davis, educated at Harvard, Berkeley, Hebrew U, and UCLA. He's the author or co-author of 7 books, including Hasidism and New History, and Gershom Scholem, Master of the Kabbalah. His most recent book is a collection of his essays, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy. His books have won the National Jewish Book Award multiple times. And I think that Eric will agree, David, that since you retired, things really haven't been the same down the road on the farm. We've really, really missed you, so it's so good to have you here. David will speak on We Await Eternity as It Approaches.
So, as they used to say on Monty Python, and now for something completely different. When Sam Shonkoff invited me to speak at a conference on the theme of life and death, I decided I didn't have an academic paper to give, and instead I'm going to give you a personal meditation on my own confrontation with mortality, which I hope fits into the theme of the conference, even if not with all the other papers. So it was in a small restaurant during an enormous rainstorm in the desert town of Ouarzazate in Morocco, where we met a portly French couple who had retired to a beachside city in that country. What, I asked them, did you do there? Their answer, as they tucked in their sumptuous tagine, on attend l'éternité qui s'approche. We await eternity as it approaches. This poetic sentence has never left me, not only for the content of the words, but for the wonderful equanimity with which they said them. Could these simple French retirees have arrived at a philosophical understanding that the rest of us, more intellectually inclined, struggle to attain throughout our lives? All living things must die, or as Shakespeare put it more poetically, golden lads and girls all must, as chimney sweepers come to dust. That iron law of biology is hard to say and even harder to understand. Why shouldn't we be at least as eternal as the rocks in the sky, or failing that, as long-lived as the sequoia sempervirens? And why have we been cursed with the consciousness of our own death, even though grasping non-existence is like trying to hold water between our fingers? It took 13 years and a terrifying diagnosis to bring me back to that encounter in the Moroccan restaurant and to ponder its wisdom. Despite my urologist's reassuring words, I knew that prostate cancer that had metastasized to the bone was almost certainly a fatal disease. I was 71 and otherwise in excellent health, biking, swimming, generally not behaving like a man in his 70s. And I weathered the first year and a half of treatment with nary a symptom. But the initial diagnosis and then the later repeated arrival of bad news always felt like a sinking feeling in the gut, an animal-like response to the threat of physical demise. The world was suddenly disoriented. The security of family, friendships, career, and all the other things that make up a happy life suddenly eroded beneath my feet. I was fortunate, at least initially, in the cancer that I chose. Incurable, but slow-growing and responsive to the least debilitating treatment. That treatment consisted of wiping all the testosterone from my body to starve the cancer cells of the fuel that makes them grow and divide. And then an additional medication to interrupt the cancer's production of its own testosterone, a self-fueling quirk that makes this cancer so different from all others. For many patients, the total eradication of all testosterone comes with a very high price: crippling fatigue, brain fog, depression, muscle wasting, and of course, the death of libido. The only scientifically proven antidote to these symptoms is vigorous exercise. including weightlifting. I was built for this treatment. Over the years, although totally unathletic as a child, I had made exercise a bit of religion, unaware that I would need to call on that devotion in this hour of darkness. So I was luckier than most to experience few side effects of what the medical profession delicately calls chemical castration. This made it possible to feel totally well even while carrying within me a deadly time bomb. Even the loss of libido, which happened within a few days of starting treatment, was not as negative as it sounds. It's paradoxical. You don't miss what you don't experience. That part of the brain, a primitive part, I think, that powered the mind for so long had shut down for good. So, since it wasn't there, I didn't miss it because I couldn't conjure it up. Having fulfilled my evolutionary destiny of fathering 2 children, I could now clear my mind for more fateful matters. It's perhaps not coincidental that my father died of prostate cancer, and the progression of his disease is always an ever-present memory. A biologist, he was teaching his last semester on the origin of life as the cancer rampaged in his body. When a rabbi, a close friend of the family, visited and asked if he wanted to talk about what he was experiencing, he replied, "I prefer to think about the origin of life and not the end." He never complained and seemed intent on living as fully as he could without conceding anything to his enemy until it was no longer possible to do so. Now, I say enemy, but is that the right term for cancer? This disease is not like a foreign invader, but instead a product of our own cells. Perhaps civil war is a better metaphor. This is, however, a civil war of a very peculiar type. The genetic theory of cancer teaches that most cancers do not arise from an environmental toxin, although, of course, there are important exceptions, such as smoking-induced lung cancer. My prostate cancer, for example, may owe something to my father's genetic legacy that he bequeathed me, or maybe not. Either way, the cancer arose from mutations within the prostate organ that seems to have a propensity to grow more than it needs to, even when the growth is benign. Rapidly dividing cells are particularly susceptible to mutations that may eventually produce a neoplasm, cells that no longer resemble prostate cells and are ready to attack any place in the body. Mutation. Without it, no life. We are human, the quintessence of stardust, because eons ago, a single-cell organism mutated so that it could become something completely different. And finally, these mutations produced us, that creature who is capable of infinite compassion and infinite cruelty to our own species. But the price of mutation is cancer. Every member of the animal kingdom, including, it seems, the dinosaurs, can produce cancer out of its cells. Perhaps cancer is even the way cells program their ultimate demise, so as to make way for our offspring. Immortality would require a different set of laws of nature. I find these insights comforting, since they make living with cancer and ultimately dying of it something that makes us human. When confronting death, we live in full awareness of our limited time. That awareness conjures up metaphysical thoughts. I am far from religious, but I now have this heightened feeling that there is something inexplicable, call it divine, about our existence. This world, with all its beauty and, yes, even all its ugliness, exists because I'm here to perceive it, interact with it, perhaps even leave a mark on it. All this will be gone when I am. I am not, though, a complete idealist. I do believe there is a universe out there of space and time, matter and energy, but it is an entirely unconscious universe into which I will disappear once I die. I might call this philosophy humanism with a spiritual face. The source of divinity is us, our work, our loves, and our very being. Once we are gone, it will be gone, and yet not fully gone, because it will live on in those who still live. The very threat of death has made me acutely aware of work and love, the twin pillars, as Freud said, of a life well lived. Instead of terror, it has had a surprising effect. The The more than 3.5 years since diagnosis has been quite literally the happiest period of my life. I published my last book some 3 years before my diagnosis, and instead of feeling that I had now so little time to write more, I felt fulfilled by the realization I had said everything I wanted to say. Obviously not entirely true, hence this short essay, as well as a volume of my collected essays. The diagnosis solidified my decision to retire, not because I might become too ill to continue, but on the contrary, because I had finished my teaching as thoroughly as I had finished my writing. While at times, decades ago, seemed a search for vocation, a doubting of my own intellectual abilities, now feels like a necessary struggle to arrive at a quiet sense that I've completed the work I was meant to do. For many, retirement is a dreaded prospect, the last station on the way to the graveyard. Not for me. Retirement is, in fact, a kind of memento mori, because it means the end of something that has been central to my life for 45 years. To accept the finality of that ending seems to me a happy lesson before one comes to the most final of endings. And what of love? The end of testosterone meant the end of sex, but not the end of love. If sex is the most intimate expression of love, it is not the only expression, and indeed it now seems to me that love without sex, not that I desired it, has its own profound intensity. One of the first effects of my diagnosis was to launch the writing of a joint memoir with my wife, based on 258 letters we exchanged during the years 1970 to 1972, when we fell in love. To recover the intensity of that period, when we were a half century younger than we are now, seemed to draw the arc of our lives, to give us a narrative that integrates everything we set out to do before we knew we would grow old together. We started our love by turning life into art, that is, letters, and then we lived it together without reflection and writing. But now we can look back and see that, like true romantics, we have lived our lives as art. If life must end, it will now end with a sense of fulfillment beyond anything I could have imagined then. My cancer has proved wilier than my doctors, and the terminology of medical science had progressed and now became what they call castration-resistant. The disease is relentless, pressured by natural selection, induced paradoxically by starving its sources of testosterone. It finds a way now to slip around its need for that peculiar hormone, and now marches implacably towards its final goal, the conquest of my body. Doesn't it realize that its immortal cell lines will die when they kill off their host? Or maybe that's their purpose to begin with. This then was the new normal, and I would vigorously explore every therapeutic option that might at least buy me time. When each of these options proceeded to fail, that in turn became the new normal. Inevitably, though, and even though I have not yet reached the stage of no therapies, death has become the new normal. As the biblical prophet Habakkuk said about the Messiah, if he tarries, he will still come. The bad news comes unexpectedly, like a thief in the night. But it is only unexpected because we can't imagine it beforehand. Our verdict has always been signed and sealed, just not yet delivered. The doctor tells you your diagnosis, often with cheery optimism, it's not as bad as it sounds. But she is only a messenger trying vainly to stem the tide of biology. In the end, we have only words, the doctor's words, my words. I have made my livelihood from words ever since the first grade, when the teacher issued a ruling that everyone could talk except me. I first made love with words in the form of letters. Then I made a living with words, written and spoken. We substitute our words for the thing itself, the insentient cells with their genetic marching orders. But words must suffice, as long as we can put this into language, we are still human and not a tumor. They say that they can buy me time, yet time is not a ripe peach for sale in the market. It is the sand in an hourglass that cannot be inverted. Whether it runs out in 3 months, a year, or 10, it will run out, and we will return to the universe. That is what the bad news means and why we need to hear it loud and clear. The wordless universe awaits, a place where there is no bad news, where there is, in fact, no news at all. There is some consolation in philosophy, although less so in the Jewish tradition that has been my field of study for the last half-century. The rabbis say little about death. They do have a vague concept of the afterlife, almost entirely missing in the Bible, but they seem more preoccupied with fear of the dying process. They aspired to die like Moses with a kiss, a release from pain that most of us will not attain. The biblical Job, learning of the death of his children and the destruction of all his property, utters the following observation: "Naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there." Dying more likely will resemble a reversal of the birthing process, but this time it will be the aged infant gathered back to his long-deceased ancestors who suffers the birthing pains rather than his mother. The Stoic philosophers have convinced me that the fear of death is irrational, because once one is dead, one no longer has any consciousness at all, and one does not know that one is dead. Yet we fear this oblivion, the loss of everything we have known and loved. But we have all been dead for millions and billions of years before we were born. So although none who experienced death return to tell us what it is like, we all know it by contemplating the infinitely long age before we were not yet alive. Nevertheless, the mind plays tricks. As an historian, I have followed Stephen Greenblatt in his, quote, desire to speak with the dead. So my mind imagines that I am still communing with millennia of people from before I was born. And looking forward, I imagine observing my funeral and memorial. I am listening to what people say, have even orchestrated my piano teacher to play the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first piece we worked on. But of course I won't be there, and I can't very well have my funeral before I die. So my consciousness is limited to 70+ years and nothing more. A different kind of process is set in, and one that is totally unexpected. As the walls close in and my time left looks more and more limited, the fear of death is losing its sting. I used to picture the angel of death as the knight on horseback who terrifies the Robin Williams psychotic character in The Fisher King. I can see him rising up over the horizon, heading straight for me. Or perhaps he looks like the most famous image in cinema, the black-cloaked figure with a whitened face who plays chess with Bergman's knight in The Seventh Seal. I was never much good at chess, so I probably couldn't hold him off for very long. But now he seems more like a little bird sitting on my shoulder, perhaps Poe's raven. He doesn't say anything, but just makes his presence known ever so gently. He doesn't frighten, but just makes it clear that one day, instead of getting up in the morning and going to the store or going swimming, I will get up and die. Or perhaps I'll get lucky and drift off into death before waking. So death, it turns out, is just one more part of life, the very last part, of course, but not somehow in a different ontological universe. My friend, the Swedish philosopher Hans Ruin, has captured something of this in his profound book, Being with the Dead. I'm quoting from him. All wounds are not healed by time. Time itself is a wound within which life prevails. We do not overcome the finitude of death. We share it with the living, to which we give birth, and for which we too will one day belong to those having been. The finitude of death, an interesting phrase, since one might have thought of death as the infinite and life as finite. But they are linked together for those of us still alive. To be alive is to be constantly in communion with the dead, with those who have been alive but are no longer. I cry for those I will leave behind, especially friends and family. But now all those generations that have gone before beckon me to join them. Death forces us to see ourselves for what we are, tiny specks in a vast universe, living infinitesimally short lives in astronomical time. or geological. I picture myself hiking in the high Sierras and stopping on top of a massive granite eminence. I gaze across the enormity of the mountains, molded by millions of years of geology. I am nothing compared to this vista, and yet am both awed and comforted by it. And so, like my biologist father, I too must surrender to biology and to its iron law. But like him, I am more than just a body. When the cells of my body are finally defeated by their malignant offspring, I will leave, I hope, a legacy to all who knew me that somehow contains a spark of the divine. Let the last words of my talk be Shakespeare's. If I must die, I will encounter darkness as a bride and hug it in mine arms. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you should.
Thank you, David. I love academic stuff, but you have made this a sacred space today. Thank you. And for the decades of your contributions to this community, even after you went to the farm, just feeling immense, deep gratitude to you for this today and for everything that's behind it. Yeah. Remarkably, this is the first session of the day that we have time left at the end. Any questions?
Thank you, David, for just a devastatingly moving talk. I think your grace in the face of l'Éternel is a model for us all. I wonder if you could, at this stage, tell us about how you think as a historian, and if you've had any epiphanies about how historians work, the questions we ask about Jewish history, about history in general. You've always been a very broad thinker. And I wonder if you've come to any new insights along with this process you're going through physically.
Well, actually, whatever insights I've come to about Jewish history are quite separate from the process I was describing. It's true that after I was diagnosed, I decided to pull together a series of seemingly unrelated essays that had appeared since 1974 and as late as 2016, and published them as this book that was mentioned, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy. And then I think I saw some connections between them, and that I did have an overarching kind of view of Jewish culture as something much more capacious than just the Jewish religion. And that's what I tried to do by publishing those essays. But I wouldn't say that the disease I described has given me any new revelations about my profession, except that it's something I mentioned in the talk that I didn't feel as if I had now run out of time, that there was something I wanted to say that now maybe I wouldn't have time enough to say. And so I feel actually very fortunate, if that's the right word, to have been diagnosed when I was, and not say 10 years earlier. Or conversely, 10 years later, in the sense that we will all get to a point, if we live long enough into our 80s or 90s, when people will more or less forget who we are. and I think I'm fortunate that hasn't hit yet. So anyway, I don't know if that's much of an answer to your question, Emily, but thank you.
My question is, I don't know that it's related, but David, thank you for your moving honesty. I was thinking about the curious coincidence of a silence in the Jewish literature on death, an attachment to writing that yielded for you, and happiness. And wondering if you might reflect on that, if there is some sort of intersection between the silence and then acceptance and happiness. So how do those two things exist?
Yeah, so that's complicated, I think. I think that, I mean, I have not studied this subject in Rabbinic Judaism. So whatever I said was sort of impressionistic rather than necessarily well-researched. I've not found any resources in the tradition that spoke to me directly to this kind of situation. But I have found very much that writing is the only way of doing it. And I take inspiration from Robert Alter, who wrote an autobiography of writing life. And that, you know, when you're a writer, that's how you come to get control of what's going on in your life. To formulate it in a way that you can't do it to yourself without actually sitting down and writing it. And so I found that actually to be quite a powerful tool. Since I was diagnosed, I've written a series of essays, some of which have appeared here in this form, and others I haven't put together yet. But yeah, I think that's, and then of course what I mentioned, the writing of this memoir, that was truly a moment of peak happiness, to be able to return to the people we were 50 years ago and to cast that in writing was enormously joyful.